Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so we're diving into this period of history when young people really shook things up.
Yeah.
Youth culture and protests in the Americas during the 1960s and 70s.
A time of major upheaval.
Totally. We've got this fascinating history podcast episode to pull from, and what's wild is how differently various countries reacted to all these, youth-led movements. We're going to try to uncover some key insights about this whole era and see how those events, well, they still resonate with us today. Did you know that right before the '68 Olympics, there were student protests in Mexico City, and they ended in a massacre?
Yeah, really dark chapter.
For sure. And get this, Canadian protests, while mirroring some stuff happening in the U.S., they took on this, totally unique character, thanks to Quebec Separatists.
Right. You can't ignore that element when you're talking about Canada at that time. It's true. This whole period was like a powder keg. Across North and South America, young people were like, enough. We're done with this. They were challenging authority figures, traditional values, and really demanding to be heard.
It's like that rejection of authority was everywhere then, whether it was students in the U.S. protesting Vietnam or those challenging one-party rule in Mexico. What led to that?
Well, the 60s, globally, it was a time of massive social and political change. Cold War, civil rights movement, and more people were realizing how unequal things were. And young people, they were at the forefront of all these movements, driven by this idea that they could make the world a better place.
And a lot of those protests, at least in the U.S., they got violent. Like the Chicago Riots in '68. During the Democratic National Convention, that must have been a turning point. In how protests were seen and how, the authorities responded.
Definitely a turning point. Students and police clashing in the streets, the whole world's watching on TV. It wasn't just about the Vietnam War anymore. It became the symbol, this huge societal divide. The old guard versus a generation that was demanding change. It really hurt the image of the Democrats, and some people argue that it actually helped Nixon win that year. Those riots showed just how much media coverage could shape public opinion and, in turn, the political landscape.
It's crazy how one event can have so many consequences.
Yeah.
Let's look at Canada for a sec. They had similar stuff happening, Vietnam War protests, the whole counterculture thing. But their government, they had a totally different approach. Why was that?
Well, even though both the U.S. and Canada had these youth movements, their governments reacted very differently. The U.S., they often tried to discredit activists and used police to put down the protests. Canada, on the other hand, they took a more, I guess you could say, tolerant stance, and the protests kind of died down without as much confrontation.
So even with similar cultural influences, they handled protests in opposite ways. Makes you think how much of it was tied to the political stuff going on at the time. But even in Canada, things weren't all peaceful, were they? Didn't they have those Quebec Separatists causing trouble?
Oh, yeah, the Quebecois Separatists. Groups like the FLQ, that added a whole different layer to Canadian protests. They were getting ideas from anti-imperialist struggles all over the world, and their push for independence from Canada, well, it sometimes got violent. Like in 1970, the October Crisis. Imagine bombings and kidnappings right in the middle of Canada.
Wow, that's intense. Shows how complex and, multi-layered these protests were. Let's head south, though, to Latin America. Student movements there seem to have been really connected to, political instability and economic inequality.
Yeah, Latin America in the 60s and 70s, it was a hotbed of political unrest. Student protests often sparked bigger uprisings. One really terrifying example is the Tlatelolco Massacre in Mexico City. October 2nd, 1968, just 10 days before the Olympics were supposed to begin, the government opened fire on student protesters.
Hold on. Days before the Olympics. What were they even protesting?
Well, they were protesting the one-party rule, and how much money was being spent on the Olympics. To a lot of people, it felt like a slap in the face, considering how much poverty there was in the country.
That's a bold move, protesting before this huge global event.
Oh, it was. And the government, they reacted brutally. The military just came down on those protesters, hundreds dead, thousands arrested, and a lot of them, they just vanished. Taken by the state, it was horrific, and it had long-lasting consequences for Mexico, domestically and internationally. Showed how authoritarian the government really was, and it tarnished their image globally.
Can't imagine going through something like that. So Mexico went with violence to deal with these student protests. What about other parts of Latin America? How did they react to these youth-led movements?
In Brazil, they had been under military rule since '64, and they took a different approach. They used propaganda to make it seem like any dissent was, a communist threat. Went so far as to rewrite textbooks praising the military, saying they're protecting national unity.
Wow, talk about controlling the narrative. So in Brazil, it was less about outright violence and more about manipulating people's perceptions. Kind of like two sides of the same coin when you compare it to Mexico. What about Argentina and Uruguay? Things were pretty intense there too, weren't they?
Absolutely. In Argentina, you had student guerrilla groups like the Montoneros. They were so desperate, they robbed banks, kidnapped people to fund their fight against the military regime. Controversial tactics, but it shows how desperate a lot of young people were under that dictatorship. And then in '76, the dictatorship started the Dirty War. State-sponsored terror campaign, something like 30,000 people disappeared, many of them students and activists.
It's heartbreaking what those young people went through. And in Uruguay.
Uruguay had the Tupamaros, another guerrilla movement, a lot of Stubby activists in that one. They were known for, well, you could say Robin Hood-esque tactics, redistributing wealth, exposing corruption. Popular at first, but their radical approach, it actually contributed to a military coup in '73. Shows how even movements that start with good intentions can end up having really bad consequences.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Youth movements in the Americas, they were a force to be reckoned with. From Chicago to Mexico City to Buenos Aires. So much idealism, this desire for a better world.
Yeah.
But they came up against some really harsh realities too.
Yeah, that tension between idealism and reality, that's really what this whole era was about. You had all these young people so driven by this vision of a just world, and they were clashing with power structures that were not willing to give up control. It makes you think about how complex social change is and all the ethical dilemmas that come with it.
Definitely makes you appreciate the challenges and the sacrifices people made to make the world better. Before we go too far down that road, though, we should talk about the generational conflict going on at the time. It was bubbling under the surface of all these movements.
Oh, for sure. And the best example of that is the counterculture movement happening in the US and Canada. Rejecting mainstream values, embracing peace and individuality, experimenting with lifestyles. The clash between young people and the older generation, it was huge.
It's like they were living on different planets. Long hair, rock music, challenging traditional ideas of family, authority. It was a cultural earthquake.
You got it. And it wasn't just superficial stuff like looks or music. It was about completely different worldviews, completely different ideas about how society should work.
Makes you wonder how those cultural clashes played out in different countries and how they influenced, where these movements ended up going.
Yeah, it's a great question and something we can dive into more as we look closer at these specific movements and their impact. It really is fascinating how those cultural clashes shaped these movements. And it's important to remember that even when these movements, even when they faced setbacks or were shut down, they still had an impact.
It's like their efforts planted seeds for change, even if they didn't, live to see the result. Makes you think about how historians interpret the legacy of these movements, especially the ones that might have seemed to, quote-unquote, fail in their immediate goals.
Historians are so important in helping us understand the long-term impacts of these movements. And there's not just one way to look at it. There are all sorts of schools of thought, each with a different perspective.
Right. You've got political history, social history, cultural history, and then there's Marxist theory. Could you give us a quick breakdown of those different lenses?
Sure. Political historians focus on how these movements changed the political landscape. For example, they might study how student activism affected Nixon's rise to power in the U.S., or the eventual shift to democracy in some Latin American countries. Social historians are more interested in what it was like for everyday people. They analyze how protests changed societies from the ground up. They might look at how student and worker activism challenged social norms and pushed for more equality.
So political historians are looking at the big picture of power structures, and social historians are zooming in on the lived experiences of people involved in these movements. What about cultural historians? What do they focus on?
Cultural historians dig into how these movements affected culture and identity. They'd explore how the counterculture movement, music, art, even generational shifts played a role in the protests and their long-term effects. Think about the influence of rock music on young people, or how visual arts were used to make social commentary and protest.
That's fascinating. It's like each historical approach gives us a piece of the puzzle, helping us see the big picture with more nuance. And then there's Marxist theory. How does that approach differ?
Marxist theorists see these youth protests as part of a larger struggle against capitalism and inequality. They believe these movements are pushing back against systems of exploitation that come from the way our economies are structured.
So Marxist theory links these movements to global forces and power systems. It's amazing how one period of history can be interpreted from so many angles, and each perspective adds another layer to our understanding. It really encourages us to think critically and consider different viewpoints.
Absolutely. And it's good to remember that these different perspectives aren't mutually exclusive. They can all exist together and even complement each other, giving us a much richer and more complete understanding of this complicated era.
It makes you realize that history isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's more like an ongoing conversation where we keep reinterpreting the past based on new evidence and perspectives.
Exactly. It's alive, it's dynamic, and these different lenses help us connect with the past in a meaningful way. We can draw connections to the present and even consider potential futures.
Speaking of the present, it's clear that the echoes of these protests are still being felt today. Many of the issues that fueled those movements, social justice, political accountability, economic inequality, are still front and center in our struggles today.
Very true. These movements might have faced strong opposition and even violence, but they planted seeds of change that are still growing today.
Like the civil rights movement in the U.S., for example. That movement was deeply connected to student activism. The fight for racial equality was central in the 60s, but that struggle continues, and a lot of the strategies used by activists today come from those earlier movements.
It's a powerful reminder that social change takes time. There will be setbacks and victories, moments of progress, and times when it feels like we're going backwards. The important thing is that the conversation continues, and we learn from the past as we work towards a more just and equitable world.
It makes you think. If those youth movements were happening today, what issues would be at the forefront? How would those protests look? What would they be demanding?
That's a thought-provoking question, almost like stepping into a different reality, but I think it's a useful exercise. It makes us think critically about today's challenges and how we can channel that same spirit of activism that drove movements in the past.
So let's imagine for a minute, it's 2023, and a new wave of youth-led movements is sweeping across the Americas. What's driving them? What are their concerns?
Climate change would be high on the list, for sure. Young people today understand the threat of climate change, and they're demanding that leaders take action. We're already seeing this with movements like Fridays for Future, with young people skipping school to highlight the climate crisis.
You're right, climate justice is a defining issue for this generation. And I bet economic inequality and the cost of living would also be big drivers of protest. Young people today are facing massive student debt, sky-high housing costs, and a job market that feels really shaky.
Those are key points. The economic realities young people face today are totally different from previous generations. It creates a sense of urgency and a need for big changes, which could lead to widespread protests.
And don't forget about social justice. Movements like Black Lives Matter and the fight for LGBTQ+ rights have shown that young people are committed to fighting against systemic racism, homophobia, transphobia, and all forms of discrimination.
Those movements have been hugely important, showing the world that young people aren't afraid to challenge the way things are and demand a fairer and more inclusive society for everyone.
So, climate change, economic inequality, social justice, all issues that young people care deeply about. But how might these protests look? Would we see those huge street demonstrations like we did in the 60s and 70s?
Probably a mix of approaches. Traditional things like marches and rallies would likely be combined with the power of social media and digital activism. Young people today are so comfortable with technology, they can mobilize and organize in ways that weren't possible just a few decades ago.
For sure. Viral campaigns, online petitions, virtual protests, hashtag activism. The potential for organizing and raising awareness online is huge. And I bet we'd see a lot of creative expression through art, music, poetry, street art, performance art. Art has always been a powerful tool for social commentary and protest.
I agree. Art can connect with people emotionally and inspire action. I imagine we'd see young people using all sorts of creative ways to express their frustrations, their hopes, and their visions for a better future.
It's exciting to think about this blend of traditional and digital activism, infused with artistic expression. It would be a force for change. But what do you think would be the biggest challenges for these modern-day movements? What obstacles would they face?
I think one of the biggest hurdles would be navigating the polarized political landscape. It's gotten harder to find common ground, and movements for change often face fierce pushback from people who benefit from the way things are.
It's like we're always up against these forces that want to stop progress and keep the status quo. Everyone's in their own echo chamber, only consuming information that reinforces what they already believe. This makes it hard to have real dialogue, find common ground, and work towards solutions that work for everyone.
Another challenge would be fighting misinformation, which spreads like wildfire online. It's so easy to manipulate public opinion and discredit social movements with targeted attacks and propaganda. Young people would have to be super careful navigating all this information and figuring out what's true.
It's like an uphill battle, trying to cut through all the noise and focus on the real issues. But honestly, I'm optimistic. Young people are digital natives. They think critically. They're not easily fooled by fake news. They have good instincts.
I'm optimistic too. Young people have always been at the forefront of change. They have so much energy, passion, and a desire to make the world a better place. I have no doubt they'll find new and effective ways to overcome these challenges and be heard. Their ability to adapt, innovate, and use technology gives me a lot of hope for the future.
It's amazing to see how those echoes from the past are still shaping how young people engage in activism today and fight for the things they believe in. This deep dive has been incredible. We've traveled from the chaotic streets of 1968 Chicago to a possible 2023, witnessing how powerful youth movements are and their ability to change history.
It's been quite a journey. It reminds us that the fight for a better future never really ends. It's like a relay race, with each generation passing the torch to the next.
Exactly. It's this collective effort, this constant striving for progress that will eventually lead to a more just and equitable world. But as we wrap up this part of our conversation, I want to emphasize something really important. We've talked a lot about the challenges, but let's not forget about hope.
You're right. Hope is what keeps us going, that belief that a better world is possible, and the conviction that our actions, even small ones, can make a difference.
And that's what these youth movements, from the past and the present, represent. They spark hope within us. They remind us that we're not alone in this fight. They inspire us to believe that change is possible, that it's within reach.
It really is, that spark of hope that ties those movements from back then to the activists we see today.
It's like this thread through time connecting all these people who wanted a better world.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And even though, they were dealing with different stuff, there are some, big similarities in what they went through.
Oh, yeah. Across the Americas, young people were standing up to authority figures, demanding accountability, fighting for a more just world for everybody.
And even with all the stuff they faced, the violence, the attempts to silence them, they still managed to, plant the seeds for the changes we're seeing now.
That's what social movements do, right? They cause ripples that go way beyond their initial goals.
It's like even when things seem impossible, even our smallest actions can make a difference.
Totally. Every time someone resists, every voice that speaks up against injustice, every step towards a more just world, it all adds up.
So as we wrap up our deep dive here, I want to leave you with something to think about.
A challenge.
Yeah, kind of. I challenge you to learn more about youth activism, the movements that shaped where you live. Get inspired by the stories of the people who came before you.
I like that. And I challenge you to think about how you can contribute to making the world a better place. What gets you fired up? What can you do, big or small, to make a difference?
Change doesn't happen overnight, right? It's a long road with ups and downs, wins and losses.
But it's a road worth traveling, and we're all on it together.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been awesome exploring all this with you.
It really has.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop fighting for the future we all deserve.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.